Imagine hiring someone to help you in your cafe, and suddenly realizing that food is mysteriously disappearing. That's exactly what happened to Clara. But what she discovered when investigating will deeply move you. Get ready for a touching story of empathy and surprising revelations that you can't miss. Mrs. Clara was behind the counter, serving the regular customers of the small and cozy cafe she ran with so much care. At 45 years old, she was proud of the business she had bought from a gentleman a few years earlier. The cafe had a special charm, with its rustic wooden tables and a welcoming atmosphere that made customers feel at home. Clara knew each of her regular patrons and knew exactly how to please them, whether with a well-brewed coffee or a generous slice of homemade cake. It was on a busy morning that Mrs. Marlene first appeared. She was a 65-year-old woman, with neatly combed gray hair and a look that conveyed a mixture of hope and despair. Marlene entered the cafe with hesitant steps, looking around before approaching the counter. Clara, busy with an order, barely noticed the arrival of the elderly woman until she positioned herself right in front of her, holding a worn-out purse with both hands. "Good morning, my dear," Marlene began with a soft but firm voice. "I'm Mrs. Marlene and I'm looking for a job. Would you happen to have an opening here at the cafe?" Clara looked up, a little surprised by the request. She was not used to seeing people of Marlene's age asking for a job in her cafe. "Oh, Mrs. Marlene, good morning," Clara replied, trying to be polite. "Look, I really appreciate your interest, but I'm not sure if we have a position that would be a good fit for you here. The work can be a bit physically demanding, you know." Clara tried to be delicate, but deep down, she doubted that Marlene had the necessary energy for the cafe's pace. Marlene kept her smile, although her eyes showed a slight hint of sadness. "I understand, Mrs. Clara. But please, consider giving me a chance. I really need this job." Clara sighed, feeling uncomfortable with the situation. She didn't want to seem insensitive, but she also needed to be practical. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Marlene. At the moment, we really don't have a suitable position for you," Clara said, trying to end the conversation gently. Marlene nodded slowly, thanking with a nod before turning to leave. Clara watched as the elderly woman left the cafe, feeling a twinge of guilt, but convinced that she had made the right decision. In the following days, Clara couldn't get Mrs. Marlene out of her head. There was something in the way she asked for the job, in her voice laden with need, that touched Clara. Even so, she tried to focus on her work, ensuring that the cafe continued to run perfectly. A week later, to Clara's surprise, Marlene returned. This time, she seemed even more determined, as if she had rehearsed every word before entering. "Mrs. Clara, I know you said no last time, but I really need this job. I'm willing to do anything, any kind of work you need." Clara was once again surprised by Marlene's persistence. "Mrs. Marlene, I really don't know if I can," she began, but Marlene interrupted her. "Please, Mrs. Clara, give me a chance. I promise you won't regret it." There was such a deep sincerity in Marlene's request that Clara couldn't ignore it. "Mrs. Marlene, I'll think about it, okay? Come back tomorrow and we'll talk more," said Clara, still a little reluctant, but unable to say no right away. Marlene smiled gratefully, a glimmer of hope lighting up her eyes. That night, Clara reflected on the situation. She remembered the difficult times she had faced before managing to stabilize the cafe. Maybe Marlene deserved a chance, just as she had her own. The next day, Clara was ready to give a definitive answer to the persistent Mrs. Marlene. Mrs. Clara was arranging the cups behind the counter when she saw the familiar figure of Mrs. Marlene enter the cafe again. Marlene seemed even more determined than the last time. Clara felt a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Good morning, Mrs. Marlene," said Clara, trying to hide her hesitation. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara," Marlene responded, with a gentle but determined smile. "I know I've been here before, but I really need this job. My husband is sick at home, and I'm the only one who can take care of him." Clara was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of Marlene's words. "I understand, Mrs. Marlene, but the work here can be quite physically demanding. I don't want you to get hurt or become too exhausted," said Clara, trying to be sensitive. Marlene took a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage she had. "I can do this, Mrs. Clara. I'm stronger than I look." Clara looked into Marlene's eyes and saw an unwavering determination. "Okay, Mrs. Marlene. I'll give you a chance. But please, let me know if you're feeling tired or if you need any help." Marlene smiled broadly, with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara. I promise I won't disappoint you." On her first day of work, Marlene arrived early, even before the cafe opened. She was eager to show that she could be useful. Clara guided her through the tasks, such as cleaning tables, serving customers, and restocking supplies. Marlene listened attentively, absorbing every detail. Throughout the day, Clara observed Marlene closely. The elderly woman moved with surprising agility, always with a smile on her face and a kind word for the customers. Clara began to realize that Marlene had a special way of dealing with people, something that could be very valuable for the cafe. "How's it going, Mrs. Marlene?" Clara asked during a break. Marlene wiped the sweat from her forehead with a handkerchief and smiled. "I'm doing well, Mrs. Clara. It's hard work, but I'm used to it. I'm just happy to be able to help and, at the same time, support my husband." Clara felt a warmth in her heart upon hearing this. As the days passed, Marlene became a constant and reliable presence in the cafe. The customers began to like her, appreciating her friendliness and dedication. Clara still had her doubts, but more and more, she felt that she had made the right decision in giving Marlene a chance. One afternoon, when the cafe was quieter, Clara and Marlene had the opportunity to talk a little more. "Mrs. Marlene, how is your husband? Is he getting better?" asked Clara, genuinely interested. Marlene sighed, with a sad look. "He has his ups and downs, Mrs. Clara. But knowing that I'm helping to keep the household going is already a relief." Clara felt a wave of empathy for Marlene. She knew how difficult it was to care for a sick person and keep the household running at the same time. "If you need anything, any time off to take care of him, just let me know, okay?" Marlene nodded, grateful for Clara's understanding. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Clara and Marlene grew stronger. Clara still observed Marlene carefully, but her initial concerns began to diminish. She realized that Marlene was a dedicated worker, someone she could trust. And, more importantly, someone who really needed that opportunity. At the end of another workday, Clara called Marlene over for a conversation. "Mrs. Marlene, I know we still have a lot to learn about each other, but I want you to know that I'm happy I gave you this chance. You're doing a great job." Marlene smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara. This means a lot to me." And so, Mrs. Marlene continued to work at the cafe, day after day, showing that age was not an obstacle to her strength and determination. In turn, Clara learned to value more and more the presence of that woman who, despite the difficulties, brought a new shine to the small and welcoming cafe. Mrs. Marlene arrived punctually on the first morning of her new job, with a smile on her face and a disposition that surprised everyone. Clara observed her from afar, still with a touch of doubt, but also with a growing curiosity about how this lady would fare in the daily tasks. Marlene, in turn, seemed determined to prove her worth, starting with the thorough cleaning of the tables and counters. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara. Where's the cleaning cloth I can use?" asked Marlene, excitedly. Clara, a little disconcerted by Marlene's energy, pointed to the cabinet. "It's there, Mrs. Marlene. You can take what you need. And please, if you need any help, let me know." Marlene smiled and went straight to work, cleaning every corner with impressive dedication. The first few days were a mixture of learning and adaptation. Marlene quickly got the hang of the tasks, from serving customers to making simple coffees. Clara was surprised at how quickly Marlene adapted. "You're doing very well, Mrs. Marlene. It's almost as if you've done this before," Clara commented. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara. I guess it's the practice of life," Marlene replied with a smile. The customers also soon noticed the new employee. Marlene had a special way of talking to everyone, making them feel welcomed. "Good morning, Mrs. Marlene. How is your husband?" asked a regular customer. "He's getting better, thank you for asking," Marlene would always respond with kindness. Clara observed these interactions and began to realize how much Marlene was adding to the cafe's atmosphere. "You have incredible energy, Mrs. Marlene. How do you do it?" Clara asked one day, as the two were organizing the supplies. Marlene smiled, with a gleam in her eyes. "I think it's the need, Mrs. Clara. When you really need something, you find strength where you didn't even know it existed." Clara felt a tightness in her heart as she heard this, admiring the new employee's strength even more. As the weeks passed, Marlene became a fundamental part of the cafe's routine. Clara could no longer imagine the place without Marlene's lively and hardworking presence. "Mrs. Marlene, you've adapted so well here. I'm truly impressed," Clara confessed. "Oh, Mrs. Clara, I'm just doing my best. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity," Marlene responded, visibly emotional. Every day, Marlene showed more and more of her ability to handle the tasks, and her energy seemed inexhaustible. Clara even began to learn a few things from Marlene, especially about how to deal with certain difficult situations with customers. "Mrs. Marlene, how do you calm down that customer who always complains about the coffee?" asked Clara. "Oh, Mrs. Clara, it's just a matter of listening patiently and showing that you care. That makes all the difference," Marlene explained. One afternoon, Clara and Marlene were closing the cafe when Clara decided to express her gratitude. "Mrs. Marlene, I don't know how to thank you enough for everything you've done. You've brought a new spirit to our cafe," said Clara. "I'm the one who's grateful, Mrs. Clara. This job means the world to me and my husband," Marlene responded, with tears in her eyes. The relationship between Clara and Marlene continued to grow stronger, based on mutual respect and admiration. Clara learned to fully trust Marlene, knowing that she could count on her for anything. "Mrs. Marlene, you're already part of the cafe family," Clara said one day, unable to hide her emotions. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Clara. This makes me very happy," Marlene responded with a sincere smile. The customers also began to notice the difference Marlene made. The cafe was busier, and Clara knew that part of this success was due to the new employee. "Mrs. Clara, Mrs. Marlene is an angel. Always so attentive," said a loyal customer. Clara just smiled and agreed, knowing that she had made the right choice in giving Marlene a chance. Over time, Mrs. Marlene not only adapted, but also became indispensable. Clara could not be happier with the decision to hire her. The energy and care that Marlene brought to the cafe were palpable. And so, the small cafe in the city center gained not only an employee, but a true friend and ally, who helped make each day a little more special. After a few weeks of a calm routine, Clara began to notice something strange in the cafe. Some supplies and food seemed to be mysteriously disappearing. At first, she thought it might be a counting error or some problem with the suppliers. After all, it was common for small confusions to occur in a bustling establishment. "Joao, can you check if we received all the bread this morning?" Clara asked her assistant as she organized the orders. "Sure, Mrs. Clara. I'll check right away," Joao replied, heading towards the stock. After a few minutes, he returned with a confused expression. "Everything's fine here, Mrs. Clara. The bread arrived in the right quantity." Clara frowned, feeling that something wasn't right. She then decided to review the entire inventory, but even after a thorough check, she didn't find anything wrong. "Am I going crazy?" she murmured to herself as she looked at the almost empty shelves of ingredients. She decided to ask Marlene's opinion, as she was always attentive to everything. "Mrs. Marlene, have you noticed anything strange with our supplies lately?" Clara asked, trying to sound casual. Marlene stopped what she was doing and thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, Mrs. Clara, I think some things are running out faster than normal," Marlene responded, with a worried look. Clara sighed, feeling a little relieved that she wasn't the only one noticing it. "I think it might be a problem with the suppliers. I'll call them and check if there was any mistake in the deliveries," said Clara, trying to find a logical explanation. She spent the afternoon on the phone, talking to different suppliers, but they all assured her that the deliveries were correct. The confusion only increased, and Clara didn't know what to think anymore. In the following days, Clara started paying closer attention to the details. She wrote down everything that came in and out of the cafe, hoping to identify where the problem was. "Joao, let's do a new inventory count at the end of the day, okay?" said Clara, determined to solve the mystery. "Sure, Mrs. Clara. We'll figure out what's going on," Joao responded confidently. Despite all the efforts, the disappearances continued. Clara felt increasingly frustrated. "Mrs. Marlene, have you seen anything suspicious around here?" Clara asked while the two were closing the cafe. "No, Mrs. Clara. Everything seems normal to me. But I'll keep an eye out," Marlene promised, trying to reassure the boss. Clara thanked her and decided she needed to find another approach. In the following days, Clara began to observe the customers more closely, suspecting that someone might be taking something without paying. But even so, she didn't find anything out of the ordinary. "This is driving me crazy, Mrs. Marlene. I don't know what else to do," Clara confessed, exhausted. "We'll solve this, Mrs. Clara. I'm sure we'll find out what's happening," Marlene said, trying to encourage her. Clara decided to install a discreet security camera in the stock area, hoping that this would help solve the mystery. "Joao, help me install this camera. Maybe we can catch what's happening here," Clara asked, hopeful. "Good idea, Mrs. Clara. Let's see if this solves it," Joao agreed as he adjusted the camera in the corner of the room. With the camera installed, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. In the following days, she checked the recordings every night, but nothing unusual appeared. "Are we really making a counting mistake?" Clara thought, starting to doubt her own suspicions. Marlene, always attentive, tried to help in every possible way, but she also had no answers. The mystery of the disappearances remained unsolved. Clara found herself increasingly intrigued, but decided that she couldn't let this affect the operation of the cafe. "Let's keep doing our best, Mrs. Marlene. Sooner or later, we'll find out what's going on," Clara said, trying to maintain a positive spirit. Absolutely, Mrs. Clara. We're in this together, Marlene responded with an encouraging smile. And so, the episode of the disappearances remained unexplained, leaving Clara and her team intrigued and alert. Although the mystery was not yet resolved, Clara's determination to keep the cafe running as best as possible never diminished. And together, Clara and Marlene continued to face the daily challenges, with the hope that eventually, the truth would come to light. After installing the security camera, Clara was determined to find out who was causing the mysterious disappearances in the cafe. Every night, after closing, she would sit in her office and review the day's recordings. At first, there was nothing suspicious. But one specific night, she saw something that left her perplexed. Marlene, her most dedicated employee, was taking some items from the stock. Clara didn't know what to think. Disappointment took over her, but at the same time, there was a growing curiosity about Marlene's motives. Why would she do this? Clara wondered, as she watched the video again. Marlene wasn't taking large quantities, but enough to be noticed. Clara decided she needed more information before taking any action. In the following days, Clara continued to observe Marlene closely, without letting her suspicion show. Good morning, Mrs. Clara. How are you today? Marlene would greet her, always with that warm smile. Good morning, Mrs. Marlene. I'm doing well, thank you, Clara would respond, trying to maintain her composure. The doubt, however, never left her mind. Clara began to question Marlene's personal life. Could she be going through difficulties, she thought. In an attempt to better understand, Clara started to engage in conversation with Marlene about her family and daily life. Mrs. Marlene, how is your husband? Has he improved? Clara asked, trying to sound casual. Yes, he has, Mrs. Clara. Getting a little better each day, Marlene replied, with a smile that seemed sincere. Determined not to make hasty decisions, Clara began to discreetly investigate. She talked to other employees and customers, trying to gather information without arousing suspicion. João, have you noticed anything strange with the supplies lately? Clara asked in a casual conversation. No, Mrs. Clara. Everything seems normal, João replied, unaware of Clara's concerns. Clara also started to observe Marlene outside of work, trying to understand her routine and possible difficulties. On a day off, she discreetly followed Marlene to her home. She saw that Marlene lived in a humble area, and the house needed repairs. Perhaps she is really in need, Clara thought, with a mix of empathy and sadness. The situation seemed more complicated than she had imagined. Meanwhile, Marlene continued to work with the same dedication as always. Mrs. Clara, we need more coffee. The stock is running out quickly, Marlene would say, unaware that Clara was already aware of the reason. I'll take care of it, Mrs. Marlene, Clara would respond, trying not to show her suspicion. It was becoming increasingly difficult for Clara to hide her dilemma. Clara's nights were restless. She tossed and turned in bed, thinking about what to do. Should I confront Marlene? What if she has a good reason? The doubt gnawed at Clara, who didn't want to make hasty decisions. The cafe was doing well, in part thanks to Marlene's hard work. But can I really trust her? Clara asked herself, feeling more and more divided. Over time, Clara decided that she needed more proof before making any accusations. She continued to review the camera footage every night, hoping for more answers. Maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, she thought, trying to convince herself. But with each new recording, the evidence against Marlene became clearer. Clara knew she couldn't ignore this for much longer. Despite everything, Clara couldn't deny Marlene's kindness and dedication in the day-to-day operations of the cafe. "Mrs. Marlene, you've been a great help here. I don't know what I'd do without you," Clara said one day, trying to gauge a reaction. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Clara. I just want to help," Marlene responded, with a spark in her eyes that left Clara even more confused. And so, Clara continued her silent investigation, torn between disappointment and curiosity. She knew that eventually, she would have to confront Marlene and discover the truth. But for now, she preferred to wait, seeking more evidence and trying to understand the true motives behind her employees' actions. Clara's dilemma was far from being resolved, and each day brought more questions than answers. After many sleepless nights and internal debates, Clara decided it was time to confront Marlene. She could no longer ignore what was happening. At the end of a long workday, Clara called Marlene for a private conversation in the office. "Mrs. Marlene, I need to talk to you about something very serious," Clara said, trying to remain calm. Marlene entered the office, visibly concerned. "Of course, Mrs. Clara." "What happened?" she asked, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Clara took a deep breath and went straight to the point. "I installed a camera in the stock area and saw that you've been taking the food." "Why are you doing this, Marlene?" Clara asked, with a mix of disappointment and curiosity. Marlene turned pale and lowered her head, ashamed. "Mrs. Clara, I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to find out this way," Marlene began, her voice trembling. "My husband, Mr. Joao, is very ill and bedridden. He can't work, and our financial situation is desperate," she confessed, tears starting to stream down her face. Clara felt a tightness in her heart upon hearing Marlene's confession. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "We could have found a solution together," Clara said, trying to understand. "I didn't want to bother you with our problems, Mrs. Clara. I know you already have many responsibilities here at the cafe," Marlene explained, still crying. Clara sighed, feeling a mix of pity and frustration. "But why steal, Marlene?" "That only complicated things," Clara said, trying to keep her voice firm. "I know, Mrs. Clara. It was a mistake. I was desperate and didn't know what to do. I just wanted to make sure my husband had something to eat," Marlene responded, with eyes full of remorse. Clara saw the pain in Marlene's eyes, and her heart softened a little. Clara looked at Marlene, trying to process everything. "I know you're going through a difficult time, but I can't ignore what you've done," Clara said, trying to be fair. "I understand, Mrs. Clara. I'm willing to accept any consequences," Marlene replied, resigned. Clara knew she had to make a difficult decision, but she also wanted to help Marlene. After a few seconds of silence, Clara made a decision. "Marlene, I'm going to give you a chance. Let's resolve this in another way," Clara said, trying to sound firm but understanding. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara." "I don't know how to thank you," Marlene said, relieved. Clara knew the situation was still complicated, but she was willing to help Marlene and her husband. "Here's what we'll do. You'll help me organize a charity event here at the cafe. We can raise funds to help your husband and other people in the same situation," Clara suggested, with an encouraging smile. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Clara." "Thank you so much," Marlene responded, emotional. Clara felt she was doing the right thing. "But, Marlene, I need you to be honest with me from now on." "Trust is essential," said Clara, looking into the employee's eyes. "I promise, Mrs. Clara. I will never hide anything from you again," Marlene assured, with sincerity. Clara knew rebuilding trust would take time, but she was willing to try, knowing Marlene's difficult situation. In the following days, Clara and Marlene began to plan the charity event. "Let's do a special breakfast to raise funds," suggested Clara. "Great idea, Mrs. Clara. I can talk to some suppliers to see if they can help us," said Marlene, enthusiastically. Clara was happy to see Marlene engaged, and she saw a new hope emerging for both of them. And so, the confrontation that could have destroyed the relationship between Clara and Marlene ended up strengthening their bond. Together, they transformed a difficult situation into an opportunity to do good. Clara knew there was still a long way to go, but she was confident that with honesty and hard work, they could overcome any challenge. After hearing Marlene and Mr. Joao's entire story, Clara was deeply moved. She couldn't stop thinking about the difficult situation the employee was facing. The next day, Clara woke up determined to do more to help. "I need to do more than just a charity event," she thought, while having her breakfast. As soon as she arrived at the cafe, Clara called Marlene for another conversation. "Marlene, I've been thinking a lot about your situation," Clara began. "I want to help you and Mr. Joao in a more consistent way." Marlene, surprised and emotional, responded, "Mrs. Clara, I'm already so grateful for everything you're doing. I don't even know how to thank you." Clara smiled and continued, "Starting today, I'll start donating food baskets to you regularly, so you don't have to worry about food at home." Marlene's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara. This will make a huge difference for us," Marlene said, emotional. In addition, Clara had another surprise for Marlene. "And there's one more thing, Marlene," Clara said, with a welcoming smile. "I'm going to increase your salary. You deserve it for your hard work and dedication here at the cafe." Marlene could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Seriously, Mrs. Clara? This is more than I could have ever dreamed of," she said, almost at a loss for words. "Yes, Marlene. You're an important part of our team, and I want you to be able to take better care of Mr. Joao," explained Clara. "I don't want you to go through this difficulty alone." Marlene, still incredulous, wiped away her tears and responded, "You have no idea how much this means to me. I'll work even harder to repay this generosity." In the days that followed, Clara made sure the food baskets were delivered regularly to Marlene's home. "Here's the first basket, Marlene. I hope it helps," said Clara, handing the heavy basket to her. "It helps a lot, Mrs. Clara." "Thank you so much," Marlene responded, with a genuine smile on her face. Clara felt a warmth in her heart seeing Marlene's happiness. With the salary increase, Marlene was able to buy better medications for Mr. Joao and even hire someone to help with his daily care. "Mrs. Clara, Mr. Joao is improving a little every day. I don't know how to thank you," Marlene shared during one of the work days. "I'm so glad to hear that, Marlene. You deserve it," Clara responded, sincerely. The relationship between Clara and Marlene grew even stronger. "Marlene, how is Mr. Joao today?" Clara would constantly ask, showing genuine interest. "He's a little stronger today, Mrs. Clara. The physical therapy is helping," Marlene would respond, with a hopeful smile. Clara felt that all her efforts were worthwhile. The other cafe employees noticed the change and began to show their support for Marlene. "If you need anything, Marlene, just let us know," said Joao and Anna, always ready to help. "Thank you, everyone. You're like a second family to me," Marlene would respond, emotional. Clara observed all of this with a satisfied smile. Over time, the cafe became more than just a workplace, it became a community of support. "Let's do a fundraiser to help other people like Mr. Joao," suggested Clara, inspired by the experience. Great idea, Mrs. Clara. We can help a lot of people, agreed Marlene, enthusiastically. The compassion Clara demonstrated ended up inspiring everyone around her. And so, through small acts of kindness and compassion, Clara not only helped Marlene and Mr. Joao overcome a difficult moment, but also transformed the cafe into a place where solidarity and mutual support were the norm. Sometimes, a small action can make a big difference, reflected Clara, proud of the environment she had helped create. After a few weeks of receiving the food baskets and with the salary increase, Marlene's financial situation began to visibly improve. She was finally able to pay some debts that had been keeping her up at night. Mrs. Clara, I was able to pay off the grocery bill and even had some left over for Mr. Joao's medications, Marlene told her, with a new spark in her eyes. Clara smiled, feeling happy to have been able to help. With the extra money, Marlene was able to hire a physical therapist for Mr. Joao, who began to show signs of improvement. He's regaining a little strength in his legs, Marlene said excitedly during a work break. That's wonderful, Marlene. I'm so happy for you both, Clara responded, genuinely pleased with the good news. One day, Marlene decided she wanted to thank Clara in a special way. Mrs. Clara, I'd like to invite you to coffee at my house as a way of saying thank you. What do you think? Marlene asked, a little shy. Clara smiled and accepted the invitation immediately. Of course, Marlene. It will be a pleasure, she replied, feeling honored by the invitation. The following Saturday, Clara went to Marlene's house. Welcome, Mrs. Clara. Please come in, Marlene said, opening the door with a warm smile. Clara entered and was greeted by the delicious aroma of fresh coffee and homemade cakes. Wow, Marlene, your home is so cozy, Clara commented, admiring the simple but loving environment. While having coffee, Clara had the chance to meet Mr. Joao. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Joao. Marlene talks a lot about you, Clara said, gently shaking his hand. The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Clara. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for us, Mr. Joao responded, with a weak but grateful voice. Clara felt a deep connection with the family in that moment. Marlene served a cornbread cake that she had made herself. I hope you enjoy it, Mrs. Clara. I made it with a lot of care, Marlene said, a little nervous. Clara took the first bite and smiled. It's delicious, Marlene. You're an excellent cook, Clara praised, seeing the relief and happiness on Marlene's face. It was a moment of pure simplicity and gratitude. During the coffee, Marlene shared a little more about her and Mr. Joao's life before the illness. He's always been a hard-working man, but this illness caught us by surprise, Marlene said, with a touch of sadness in her voice. I can imagine how difficult it must have been. But you both are so strong, commented Clara, admiring the couple's resilience. Clara realized how that simple act of compassion had made such a huge difference in Marlene and Mr. Joao's lives. Marlene, your strength inspires me to want to do even more for our community, Clara said, feeling motivated. And you, Mrs. Clara, are an angel in our lives, Marlene responded, holding Clara's hand with gratitude. When it was time to leave, Clara said goodbye with a warm hug. Thank you so much for the coffee and the company, Marlene. It was a pleasure to be here, Clara said, feeling like part of the family. Thank you, Mrs. Clara. You will always be welcome in our home, Marlene responded, her eyes shining with emotion. On the way back home, Clara reflected on everything that had happened in the past few weeks. Sometimes, life gives us opportunities to help others in ways we never imagined, she thought, with a smile on her face. Clara felt that this encounter had further strengthened the bonds of friendship and solidarity between her and Marlene. And so, with small acts of kindness and support, Marlene and Mr. Joao began to overcome their difficulties. Clara knew the journey was still long, but she was confident that, together, they could face any challenge. Overcoming is a path that is walked with love and unity, Clara reflected, feeling more determined than ever to continue helping those in need. When Clara arrived at Marlene's house, she was greeted with the same warm smile as always. "Welcome, Mrs. Clara. Please come in," Marlene said, opening the door. Clara entered and felt the familiar aroma of fresh coffee and cake. "Thank you, Marlene. I always love coming here," Clara responded, feeling at home. Soon, Marlene took her to the living room where Mr. Joao was sitting in an armchair. "Mrs. Clara, this is my husband, Joao," Marlene introduced. Clara smiled and extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Joao. Marlene speaks very highly of you," she said. Joao grasped Clara's hand, and his eyes lit up with sudden recognition. "Clara, you're the new owner of the cafe, aren't you?" Joao asked, his voice trembling. Clara, a little surprised, nodded. "Yes, that's me." "Why?" Joao gave a small smile and continued. "I'm the former owner of the cafe. I sold it to you before I got sick," he revealed, with a nostalgic look. Clara was stunned. "My goodness, Mr. Joao. You're the gentleman who sold me the cafe." "I had no idea," she exclaimed. Joao nodded, emotional. "Yes, that's me. I used the money for the treatments, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough," he explained with a sigh. Clara felt a wave of compassion and surprise. "You have no idea how important your help has been to us, Clara," Joao said, his eyes welling up with tears. "Not only did you save our lives, but you also kept the essence of the cafe alive." Clara felt a lump in her throat and responded, her voice trembling, "Mr. Joao, I only did what I thought was right. You both deserve all the help in the world." In an emotional moment, Joao grasped Clara's hand and said, "I've always wanted the cafe to be a place of love and warmth. I see that it's in good hands with you." Clara, with tears in her eyes, smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Joao. It was a privilege to continue your legacy," she said, feeling a deep connection to the history. Marlene, seeing the emotion on the faces of the two, was also moved. "Mrs. Clara, I have no words to thank you for everything you've done for us," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Clara hugged Marlene and whispered, "You are an inspiration to me. I'm here for whatever you need." That moment sealed an even stronger bond between them. Clara realized that her kindness had not only saved a life, but also preserved something much deeper. "Mr. Joao, I promise I will continue to care for the cafe with all the love you always had for it," Clara affirmed. Joao smiled, satisfied. "I know you will, Clara. You have a noble heart," he said, with confidence. As they enjoyed coffee together, Clara felt that this encounter had a special meaning. "It's funny how life connects people in unexpected ways," she reflected. Joao agreed, saying, "Yes, Clara. And sometimes, those connections are exactly what we need to overcome challenges." Clara smiled, feeling more motivated than ever. When it was time to leave, Clara said goodbye with a warm hug from Marlene and Mr. Joao. "Thank you for everything, Clara. You will always be part of our family," Marlene said, emotional. "And you are part of mine," Clara responded, with a sincere smile. As she left, Clara felt that she had found not just a responsibility, but a true life mission. On her way home, Clara reflected on the surprising revelation and the deep connection she felt with Marlene and Mr. João. Kindness truly transforms lives, she thought. Clara knew that with love and generosity, she could continue to make a difference in the lives of the people around her. And with that certainty, she moved forward, determined to keep the essence of the cafe and the soul of her community alive.